The common myth says Wolfman Jack was remembered because he sounded fun, strange, and loud. That explanation feels comfortable, and it is also incomplete. The deeper truth is this. Wolfman Jack survived in our hearts because he arrived when voices were controlled, playlists were filtered, and young listeners were rarely spoken to as equals. His signal crossed borders, rules, and expectations, and when it did, it made people feel chosen rather than targeted. To understand how one man became a permanent echo in modern culture, we have to trace where that signal first broke through the dark.
Wolfman Jack! You heard of Hell on Wheels? Well, you got Wolfman Jack, and I is Hell on Word. But underneath all this roughness can be found some good times, baby!
Robert Weston Smith was not supposed to matter this much. Born in 1938 in Brooklyn, New York, he entered radio during an era when playlists were sanitized, accents were flattened, and authority flowed one way, from station managers down to listeners. American radio in the 1950s sold safety, polish, and restraint, and anything raw or unpredictable was treated as a liability. That atmosphere created the conditions for something unexpected to break through. By the early 1960s, Smith had reinvented himself as Wolfman Jack, a character built from growls, laughter, and rhythm rather than credibility or credentials. The real rupture came in 1964 when he began broadcasting from XERF-AM and later XERB, so-called border blaster stations located just across the US-Mexico line. These stations operated under Mexican law, which allowed transmitters pushing up to 250,000 watts, a power level illegal in the United States. At night, that signal did something extraordinary. It traveled across dozens of states, bouncing off the ionosphere, slipping into bedrooms, cars, diners, and factory floors. Geography stopped mattering, regulations stopped mattering, class lines blurred. A teenager in Iowa heard the same voice as a truck driver in Texas, both believing the show was somehow meant for them alone.
The definitive account of this moment appears in Border Radio by Gene Fowler and Bill Crawford Jr., a historical study that traces how American broadcasters used Mexican transmitters to bypass US restrictions during the mid-20th century. The book documents how these stations became havens for experimental formats, independent music, and personalities that domestic networks considered too volatile. Wolfman Jack was not an accident inside that system, he was its purest expression. What set him apart was not just volume or novelty. He spoke directly to listeners, called them by invented names, laughed mid-sentence, and let records play long past their approved runtime. That looseness created intimacy, and intimacy was rare in mass media at the time. Young audiences were used to being managed, corrected, or sold to, not welcomed. This was the 0 point. Before the movies, before the merchandise, before the mythology, there was simply a voice riding a legal wattage through the night, proving that culture often moves fastest where rules lose their grip. And once that door opened, the system responded. 1964 marked the shift from curiosity to phenomenon. That year, Wolfman Jack's broadcasts from XERF began pulling audience numbers that legal US stations could not touch, especially after sunset. Industry estimates from the period, cited in Border Radio, suggest his nighttime signal reached as many as 40 states, with potential exposure to tens of millions of listeners on clear nights. Those numbers mattered because American radio had never been designed for that scale of intimacy. The turning point was not fame, it was attention from power. Regulators noticed, advertisers noticed, network executives noticed. The Federal Communications Commission had spent decades enforcing strict wattage caps and content standards to maintain order across the airwaves. Border blasters made that architecture irrelevant. One transmitter outside jurisdiction could overpower hundreds inside it, and Wolfman Jack was the most recognizable proof. What changed everything was how listeners behaved. Fan mail poured in by the thousands each week, addressed simply to Wolfman Jack USA. Requests came from farm towns, inner cities, military bases, and highways cutting through empty desert. These were not passive listeners, they were participants, shaping the show through letters, dedications, and shared slang. Radio had trained audiences to consume quietly, and suddenly they were speaking back. Data from advertising trade journals in the mid-1960s showed a spike in youth-targeted spending tied to late-night radio, especially record sales following Wolfman Jack spins. Songs that received airplay on his show often jumped regional charts within days, bypassing label promotion pipelines. That created friction. Established stations accused border broadcasters of undermining fair competition, while record executives quietly courted the very exposure they publicly criticized. The moment hardened in 1965 when U.S. officials increased diplomatic pressure on Mexico to rein in high-powered transmitters. Several stations reduced output or shut down entirely. Wolfman Jack adopted immediately, shifting frequencies, changing locations, and leading harder into the persona. The voice became more exaggerated, the laughter more chaotic, the show more theatrical. Restriction did not silence him, it sharpened him. This was the pivot. The Wolfman stopped being just a broadcaster and became a symbol of something larger, a reminder that systems built for control struggle when audiences discover alternatives that feel human. Media institutions could regulate towers, licenses, and borders, but they could not regulate the bond formed in the dark between a voice and a listener. That bond demanded an explanation beyond technology, which is where theory enters the picture. Marshall McLuhan offered the cleanest lens for understanding what Wolfman Jack unlocked. In his 1964 book, Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man, McLuhan explained that the form of a medium reshapes human relationships more deeply than the content moving through it. He called radio a tribal drum, a technology that collapses distance and restores intimacy through sound alone. That framework fits this story with unsettling precision. Radio stripped away faces, clothing, age, race, and status, leaving only presence. Wolfman Jack exploited that condition deliberately. The gravel in his voice felt physical, like sandpaper against the ear, while the laughter signaled chaos inside a system built on order. Listeners could not see him, which meant they filled in the gaps themselves, projecting trust, rebellion, humor, and belonging onto a sound that refused to behave. The mask mattered more than the man. Robert Weston Smith understood that anonymity granted permission. Without a visible identity to judge, the voice slipped past cultural gatekeepers and entered spaces that television could not. Bedrooms, cars, night shifts, and lonely highways became private theaters. The audience did not feel broadcast to, they felt accompanied. McLuhan argued that electronic media revives pre-industrial social bonds by reintroducing immediacy. Wolfman Jack turned that theory into practice. He spoke as if time did not exist, stretching songs, interrupting himself, responding to letters days or weeks later as if they had arrived moments ago. That distortion of time made the listener feel present rather than scheduled. The persona also functioned as protection. The exaggerated howl, the nickname, and the theatrics acted as insulation against ownership. Corporations could license a voice, but they could not fully possess a myth that lived in the listener's imagination. That separation allowed Wolfman Jack to move between outlaw radio, mainstream television, and Hollywood cameos without losing his core appeal. Here is the quiet contradiction. The very mask that created freedom also trapped him inside it. Audiences wanted the Wolfman forever, not the man behind the microphone. The character became the commodity, while the creator remained legally and financially vulnerable, negotiating contracts that often undervalued the cultural force he commanded. This tension between intimacy and control sets up the deepest irony of all, because the system that feared his influence eventually learned how to absorb it. By the early 1970s, Wolfman Jack had become impossible to ignore. Hollywood noticed first. His voice and persona appeared in films, television shows, commercials, and syndicated radio programs, including a highly visible role in American Graffiti. To the public, this looked like triumph, the outlaw welcomed inside the gates. Behind the scenes, the economics told a colder story. Media consolidation was accelerating. Large networks learned how to package counterculture without surrendering control. Wolfman Jack's character was licensed, franchised, and distributed, often under contracts that favored stations and studios over the talent that drew audiences in the first place. Ownership of airtime mattered more than ownership of identity, and the infrastructure always held the advantage. This is where the paradox sharpens. The voice that felt radically personal was now being scaled industrially. Syndication turned intimacy into a repeatable product. Recorded segments replaced live chaos. Spontaneity was trimmed to fit clocks, ad breaks, and affiliate schedules. The howl remained, but the edges were dulled. Political economy scholars describe this process as absorption. Cultural threats are rarely destroyed outright. They are neutralized by being made profitable. Wolfman Jack was no longer an anomaly in the system. He became proof that the system could digest rebellion and resell it safely. The character survived, but the conditions that made him dangerous did not. Financially, this shift carried consequences. Despite national recognition, Smith's earnings fluctuated wildly across decades, shaped by contract disputes, station changes, and shifting formats. Fame did not guarantee stability. The mythology suggested dominance, but the balance of power stayed uneven. Yet, listeners did not abandon him. Loyalty persisted because the emotional memory of those early broadcasts remained untouched. Audiences rarely track who owns a signal or who controls distribution. They remember how something made them feel the first time it entered their life. That emotional residue explains why Wolfman Jack never faded, even as media moved on. But it also raises a darker question about what happens when systems learn to copy warmth without creating it. 1995 closed the chapter on the man, but not on the signal. Robert Weston Smith passed away that year at 57, and the announcement landed quietly compared to the noise he once commanded. No emergency broadcast tone marked the moment. No nationwide pause followed. Radio kept moving forward, faster and cleaner, exactly as systems prefer. What survived was not a format, but a feeling. DJs who came after him borrowed cadence, looseness, and the illusion of direct conversation. Late-night radio hosts leaned into warmth. Podcasters decades later adopted the same intimacy, speaking as if addressing one listener rather than a crowd. The architecture changed, but the emotional math stayed intact. Media theorists often talk about parasocial connection without naming its ancestors. Wolfman Jack built that bond before the term existed. Listeners carried his voice through breakups, long drives, factory shifts, and adolescent restlessness. Memory welded sound to emotion, and emotion resists erasure better than technology. The paradox is this: digital media offers infinite choice, yet rarely recreates the sense of discovery that came from turning a physical dial and stumbling into something alive. Algorithms serve familiarity, while Wolfman Jack delivered surprise. You did not find him, he found you, which gave the encounter weight. Even now, recordings circulate online, scratchy and imperfect. The hiss remains, the timing drifts. None of it sounds modern, and none of it needs to. Those imperfections are the point. They remind listeners of a time when connection felt accidental and therefore honest. His endurance reveals something uncomfortable about progress. Efficiency improves reach, but often weakens intimacy. Control increases clarity, but drains mystery. Wolfman Jack thrived inside the cracks, and once those cracks narrowed, nothing quite replaced what was lost. All that remains is the question of why certain voices stay with us long after the machines that carried them disappear. What Wolfman Jack exposed was not a flaw in radio, but a flaw in power. Mass media claimed reach as its greatest strength, yet struggled to sound human once control tightened. His rise showed that intimacy does not emerge from polish, it emerges from risk, and risk terrifies systems built on predictability. By the late 20th century, broadcasting had become an architecture of certainty. Playlists were tested, voices were coached, and spontaneity was treated as a liability. That shift did not happen by accident. Consolidation rewarded sameness because sameness travels cleanly across markets. A rough voice with unplanned laughter does not scale easily, and not as precisely why it worked. Here lies the paradox. Wolfman Jack connected with millions by behaving as if he were speaking to one person, while modern media speaks to individuals by behaving like a machine. Personalization replaced personality. Data replaced instinct. The result sounds efficient and feels hollow. His legacy also unsettles ideas about ownership. Institutions owned towers, licenses, and distribution, yet the emotional bond belonged to no one. It lived inside memory. That imbalance still haunts media economics. Platforms extract value from attention, but they cannot manufacture the moment when a listener feels recognized rather than managed.
Cultural power rarely announces itself as rebellion. Sometimes it arrives as laughter in the dark, riding static across borders that were never meant to be crossed. Wolfman Jack did not argue with authority, he ignored it, and that refusal proved more effective. This is why his name persists without constant revival campaigns. No algorithm needs to remind people why he mattered. The memory resurfaces on its own, triggered by night drives, old songs, or the simple act of listening alone. The signal did not survive because it was preserved. It survived because it changed how people understood connection. And once that understanding exists, it does not vanish. What remains is not nostalgia, but a quiet measure of loss. The knowledge that something essential slips away when voices stop sounding like people and start sounding like systems.
Wolfman Jack did not endure because history protected him. He endured because memory did. Systems remember numbers, contracts, and ratings, but people remember moments when they felt less alone. That difference explains everything. His voice arrived without permission, without polish, and without certainty, and it stayed because it carried presence rather than authority. Listeners did not hear expertise, they heard companionship. In a media age that increasingly confuses volume with meaning, that distinction becomes rare. What lingers is not the howl itself, but the space it created. Nighttime felt inhabited. Silence felt shared. Music felt chosen, not delivered. Those sensations cannot be archived properly because they were never products. They were experiences shaped by timing, chance, and vulnerability. The tragedy is not that Wolfman Jack belongs to the past. The tragedy is that the conditions which allowed him to exist have been engineered out of modern media. Control tightened. Risk vanished. Surprise became inefficient. Connection turned measurable. And yet, the memory refuses to cooperate. It resurfaces whenever a voice sounds unscripted, whenever a broadcast feels accidental, whenever someone speaks as if one listener matters more than an audience. That instinct traces back to a time when a signal crossed borders and reminded people that media could feel human. Wolfman Jack remains in our hearts because he proved something that systems still struggle to accept. Technology can carry a voice, but only humanity makes it stay. The dial went quiet, but the echo never did.